My name is Dr. Nolan Ashworth. I'm a forensic pathologist who spent 18 years examining the dead. When Yellowstone erupted and plunged the world into an ice age apocalypse, those skills became my only chance at survival. For 48 hours, I fought hypothermia, violence, and impossible choices while searching for my daughter in Denver. My expertise with death was about to become my guide for staying alive. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Dr. Nolan Ashworth, and I've spent the last 18 years of my life examining dead bodies. Every morning, I'd walk into the Cook County Medical Examiner's office in Chicago, put on my scrubs, and try to piece together how someone's life ended. Heart attacks, overdoses, homicides, accidents. I thought I'd seen every way a human being could die. I was wrong. Tuesday, September 15th, started like any other day. I remember parking my Honda in the same spot I'd used for the past 3 years, grabbing my coffee from the machine in the lobby and checking my schedule. One autopsy scheduled for 10 in the morning. A middle-aged construction worker who'd collapsed on a job site. Routine stuff. I'd probably be done by lunch. See, forensic pathology isn't glamorous like they show on television. Most of my cases were straightforward. Natural causes, accidents, the occasional suicide. Real detective work happened maybe once every few months. The rest was just methodical examination, taking measurements, documenting findings, writing reports. I developed a system over the years. Everything had its place, every procedure had its order. That's what kept me sane in a job where chaos and violence were the norm. I should mention something about my personal life, because it becomes important later. My ex-wife Sarah used to say I was married to my work more than I was married to her. She wasn't wrong. When you spend 40 hours a week with corpses, it does something to you. Makes you distant. Clinical. I'd come home and Sarah would want to talk about her day, about normal life problems, and I'd just listen with this analytical detachment that drove her crazy. She said it was like living with a robot. Our daughter Emma was 15 when Sarah finally had enough. The divorce was finalized 2 years ago, and Emma chose to live with her mother in Denver. I got every other weekend, holidays alternating, standard custody arrangement. Emma and I had a good relationship, considering. She understood that Dad worked with dead people and that made him a little weird. She'd joke about it sometimes, ask me if I'd learned anything interesting from my patients that day. The last time I talked to Emma was the Sunday before everything happened. She'd called to tell me about some boy at school she had a crush on. Normal teenage stuff. I remember giving her this very clinical advice about adolescent brain development and decision-making, and she laughed and said, "Dad, sometimes I just want you to be a regular person, not a doctor." I told her I'd try to work on that. I wish I could go back and have that conversation again. Anyway, Tuesday morning I was in autopsy suite 2, about an hour into my examination of the construction worker, when the building started shaking. At first, I thought maybe it was subway construction. Chicago's always tearing up the streets for something. But then the vibrations got stronger. The metal table I was working on started sliding across the floor. The overhead light fixtures were swaying back and forth like pendulums. I stepped back from the body and looked around. This wasn't normal. In 18 years of working in that building, I'd never felt anything like it. The shaking lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When it stopped, I could hear car alarms going off outside. People were shouting in the hallways. My first thought was earthquake, but Chicago doesn't get earthquakes. Not real ones. Then I remembered something from my college geology classes. Seismic activity can travel thousands of miles through bedrock. If something big enough happened somewhere else, we might feel it here. I pulled off my latex gloves and walked to the window. From the 4th floor of the medical examiner's building, I had a decent view of downtown Chicago. Everything looked normal. Traffic was moving. People were walking on the sidewalks. But there was something different about the sky. It had this weird quality to it, like the air was thicker than usual. That's when Dr. Martinez burst into my suite. Carlos Martinez had been working at the ME's office for 12 years. He was usually calm, methodical like me, but that morning his face was pale and he was breathing hard like he'd been running. "Nalan, you need to see the news right now," he said. "Turn on Channel 7. There was a small television mounted in the corner of each autopsy suite. We rarely used them, but they were connected to basic cable for those long overnight shifts. I grabbed the remote and flipped to the local news station. The anchor looked shaken. Behind her, they were showing aerial footage of what looked like a massive explosion. Smoke and ash billowing up into the atmosphere, so high it disappeared into the clouds. The banner at the bottom of the screen read, "Breaking, Yellowstone Supervolcano ERUPTS." I've always been analytical by nature. It's what made me good at my job. So while Carlos was standing there with his mouth hanging open, I was processing the information. Yellowstone National Park is about 800 miles from Chicago. The seismic waves from an eruption there could easily have caused the shaking we felt. But that wasn't what worried me. "Carlos, do you remember anything from geology class about volcanic winter?" I asked him. He shook his head. "What are you talking about?" "When a volcano erupts, it throws ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere," I explained. "If it's big enough, it can block sunlight on a global scale. Temperatures drop, crops fail. It's like a nuclear winter, except it's natural." The news anchor was talking to some expert from the University of Chicago. The man looked terrified. He was explaining that the Yellowstone caldera was a supervolcano, one of the largest volcanic systems in North America. When it erupted, and he emphasized when, not if, it would be a catastrophic event. "The ash cloud is already spreading east," the expert said. "We're looking at a massive disruption to air travel, agriculture, and potentially global climate patterns. People in the immediate impact zone need to evacuate immediately. Those in the broader region should prepare for significant ash fall and temperature drops." I looked at Carlos. "We need to call our families." I tried Emma first. The call went straight to voicemail. Denver was west of Yellowstone, so they would have been hit first. I tried Sarah's number. Same thing. Voicemail. I left a message telling them to get underground, seal the windows, and call me as soon as possible. Carlos was having the same problem reaching his wife and kids. Cell towers were probably overloaded with everyone trying to make calls at the same time. Either that, or the ash was already interfering with signals in some areas. By noon, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. I know because I checked the weather station data on my computer every half hour. In September in Chicago, we should have been looking at temperatures in the mid-70s. Instead, it was 58 degrees and falling. The sky outside was turning this sickly yellow-gray color, like an old bruise, if that makes sense. The ash cloud was still hundreds of miles away, but its effects were already reaching us. The sunlight looked filtered, diffused. Everything had this eerie quality to it, like the world was holding its breath. Most of my colleagues had left by this point. Dr. Peterson, the chief medical examiner, had dismissed all non-essential personnel around 11:30. Carlos stayed for a while, but by 2 o'clock he decided to go home to his family. I didn't blame him. I should have left too. That would have been the normal thing to do. But I kept thinking about my emergency preparedness kit in my office. 3 years ago, after the anthrax scares at some government buildings, the county had required all medical facilities to maintain emergency supplies. Biological hazard protocols, they called it. Most people forgot about them, but I'd kept mine updated. Water, non-perishable food, basic medical supplies, even a battery-powered radio. There was something else keeping me there too, though I didn't want to admit it at the time. The building felt safe. The medical examiner's office was built like a fortress. Thick concrete walls, sealed ventilation systems, backup power generators. It was designed to handle biological hazards, chemical spills, even potential terrorist attacks. If ash was about to start falling from the sky, this seemed like a good place to be. Around 3 in the afternoon, it started snowing ash. Not regular snow. Thick, heavy flakes of gray volcanic ash that stuck to everything they touched. I watched from my office window as it accumulated on cars, on sidewalks, on people's clothing. Within an hour, there was a visible layer covering everything outside. That's when the real problem started. The power grid began having issues around 4 o'clock. Rolling blackouts, the news called them. ComEd was trying to manage the increased demand as everyone cranked up their heating systems. But I could see the real problem from my window. The ash was getting into everything, coating power lines, clogging air intake systems, interfering with electrical equipment. By 6 that evening, the temperature had dropped to 42 degrees. The ash fall was so thick that visibility was down to maybe 50 feet. It was like being in a blizzard, except the snow was gray and it burned your lungs when you breathed it. I tried calling Emma and Sarah again. Still no answer. The landlines weren't working either. I turned on my emergency radio and started scanning frequencies. Most of the local stations were broadcasting evacuation instructions and emergency information. Stay indoors. Seal windows and doors. Wear masks if you have to go outside. Do not drive unless absolutely necessary. The Federal Emergency Management Agency was setting up shelters in schools and community centers, but they were recommending that people stay where they were unless their current location was unsafe. Travel was becoming increasingly dangerous as the ash accumulated on roads and continued to fall. Around 8 o'clock, the power went out completely. I was in my office when it happened. 1 second I was reading emergency bulletins on my computer, and the next second everything went dark. The building's backup generators kicked in immediately, but I knew they wouldn't last forever. These systems were designed for short-term outages, maybe 12 to 24 hours at most. The backup power covered essential systems only. Basic lighting in the hallways, the refrigeration units for the morgue, and the air filtration system. My office was dark, but I could see emergency lighting glowing under my door. That's when I realized I might be the only person left in the building. I grabbed my flashlight from my emergency kit and did a quick walkthrough of all 5 floors. The place was empty. Even the night security guard had left. I was alone with 43 bodies in cold storage and whatever was happening outside. I went back to my office and tried to assess the situation logically. The temperature was continuing to drop. The ash was getting thicker. The power grid had failed. Communication systems were down. This wasn't a temporary disruption. This was the beginning of something much worse. I thought about my car in the parking lot. By now, it was probably buried under several inches of ash. Even if I could get it started, driving through this would be suicide. The roads were undoubtedly clogged with abandoned vehicles and desperate people trying to escape the city. But where would I go? My apartment was 20 minutes away under normal conditions. It was a 5th-floor walk-up with thin walls and old windows, not exactly built for this kind of emergency. Emma and Sarah were in Denver, assuming they were still alive. I had no way of reaching them and no way of getting to them. The logical choice was to stay put. The medical examiner's building was solid. It had backup power, an independent air filtration system, and enough space to ride out whatever was coming. Plus, I had access to medical supplies, tools, and my emergency kit. There was another factor I haven't mentioned yet: the morgue itself. Our cold storage room was maintained at 38 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. With the outside temperature dropping rapidly, that cold storage room was actually going to be warmer than the rest of the building soon. I know how that sounds, hiding in a room full of dead bodies while the world ends outside. But after 18 years in this job, the dead don't bother me. They're predictable, safe. They don't panic, they don't make bad decisions, and they don't take resources away from the living. By 10 o'clock, the backup generators were starting to strain. I could hear them laboring in the basement. The ash was probably clogging their air intake filters. I had maybe 2 hours before they failed completely. I made my decision. I went to the cold storage room and started moving bodies to make space. We had 43 occupied drawers, but the room itself had space for additional gurneys if needed. I found an empty gurney and positioned it in the corner farthest from the refrigeration units. Then I gathered everything I thought I'd need from my office and the medical supply rooms. My emergency kit had enough food and water for 3 days. The medical supplies included basic first aid equipment, some medications, and a few surgical instruments. I also grabbed several body bags. They might sound morbid, but body bags are essentially heavy-duty sleeping bags. Excellent insulation in a survival situation. The hardest part was accepting what I was about to do. I was going to seal myself in a room with dozens of corpses while Chicago froze around me. My analytical mind said it was the smart choice. My emotional mind was screaming that this was insane. But I'd spent 18 years studying how people die. Hypothermia, specifically, was something I'd seen dozens of times. I knew exactly how the human body shuts down when exposed to extreme cold. I knew the warning signs, the progression, the timeline. That knowledge was about to become the difference between life and death. At 11:30, the backup generators finally gave out. The building went completely dark except for my flashlight. The temperature inside started dropping immediately. Within an hour, I could see my breath in the hallways. I sealed myself in the cold storage room just after midnight. 46 hours later, I would emerge into a world that no longer existed. But I didn't know that yet. At that moment, all I knew was that I was alone in a morgue with 43 dead bodies, and the temperature outside was heading toward zero. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my entire career studying death, and now death was studying me back. The difference was, I intended to survive long enough to see what happened next. My 18 years with the dead were about to teach me everything I needed to know about staying alive. The cold storage room was maintained at 38 degrees, which sounds freezing until you realize that outside it was already 22 degrees and dropping fast. I'd made the right choice, even if it felt completely insane. I was warmer surrounded by dead bodies than I would have been anywhere else in the building. I set up my makeshift camp in the corner farthest from the refrigeration units. The constant hum of the cooling system had stopped when the power failed, but the insulated walls were keeping the temperature stable for now. I arranged my emergency supplies on a metal cart and used 2 body bags as insulation, laying one on the floor like a sleeping bag and keeping the other as a blanket. The first few hours were the worst psychologically. I'd worked with dead bodies for 18 years, but I'd never spent the night with them. In the darkness, with only my flashlight for illumination, every shadow looked like movement. Every sound from the building settling made me think someone was walking around outside. But gradually, my analytical mind took over. These were just biological specimens. Former people, yes, but no longer capable of causing me harm. What worried me more was the mathematics of survival. My emergency kit had enough food and water for 3 days, maybe 4 if I rationed carefully. But this wasn't going to be a 3-day event. Volcanic winters could last months, even years depending on the size of the eruption. I needed to start thinking long-term. I tried my battery-powered radio again around 2 in the morning. Most stations were off the air, but I managed to find one emergency broadcast still transmitting. The information was grim. The ash cloud from Yellowstone had spread across the entire Midwest. Temperatures were dropping below freezing as far south as Oklahoma. The federal government was declaring a national emergency and activating disaster response protocols. But here's what really caught my attention. The broadcaster mentioned that Denver had lost all communication around 6 hours ago. No radio, no television, no internet. Complete blackout. That meant Emma and Sarah were in the direct path of the worst effects. I tried not to think about what that might mean for their survival chances. Around 4 in the morning, I heard something that made me sit up and listen carefully. Voices outside the building. People were shouting to each other, though I couldn't make out the words through the thick walls. I turned off my flashlight and listened. There were definitely people out there. Multiple voices, moving around the exterior of the building. I made a decision that probably saved my life. I stayed hidden. See, in my line of work, I'd learned to read crime scenes. I'd seen what people do to each other when they're desperate. When society breaks down, when normal rules don't apply anymore, humans can become incredibly dangerous. These weren't rescue workers or government officials. If they were, they would have identified themselves, tried to communicate through official channels. These were people looking for shelter, resources, or both. I stayed in that cold storage room for 6 more hours, listening to voices come and go outside. Sometimes they seemed to be right outside my window. Other times they sounded like they were trying doors or windows, looking for a way into the building. But the medical examiner's office was built like a fortress, remember. Reinforced doors, security systems, limited access points. Even without power, it wasn't easy to break into. Around 10 in the morning, I decided to risk a look outside. I crept out of the cold storage room and made my way to my office window on the 4th floor. What I saw will stay with me forever. Chicago looked like the surface of another planet. Everything was covered in a thick layer of gray ash. Cars were buried up to their windows. The streets were clogged with abandoned vehicles, some still running with their doors open like people had just walked away from them. The ash was still falling, though not as heavily as the night before. But what really got my attention were the people. There were maybe 20 individuals gathered in the parking lot below, huddled around what looked like a small fire they'd managed to start in a metal trash can. They were wearing whatever cold weather gear they could find, but most of them were clearly unprepared for these conditions. I could see people shivering, stamping their feet, holding their hands close to the fire. These weren't looters or criminals. These were regular people who'd been caught in the disaster and were trying to survive. Office workers, maybe some residents from nearby apartments. People like me who'd made the wrong choice about where to ride out the catastrophe. I watched them for about an hour. During that time, I saw 2 people collapse. The others tried to help them, drag them closer to the fire, but I could tell from my vantage point that they were showing signs of severe hypothermia. Confusion, loss of coordination, eventually unconsciousness. Without proper medical treatment, they were going to die. That's when my professional training kicked into overdrive. I'd spent 18 years studying how the human body fails under extreme conditions. I knew exactly what these people were going through and what they needed to survive. The question was whether I could help them without putting myself at risk. I made another decision that changed everything. I decided to make contact. I opened my office window and called down to them. "Hey, you need to get inside somewhere. 2 of your people are showing signs of severe hypothermia." The group looked up at me like I was some kind of miracle. One man, tall guy in a business suit with a winter coat thrown over it, stepped forward. "The building's locked," he shouted back. "We've been trying to get in for hours. Are you alone up there?" I considered lying, but something about his demeanor told me he wasn't a threat. "Yeah, I'm alone. I work here. Give me 5 minutes and I'll come down and let you in." Now, opening that door was probably the biggest risk I'd taken so far, but I couldn't just watch people die in my parking lot when I had the knowledge and resources to help them. It went against everything I'd learned in medical school, everything I believed about the value of human life. I went back to the cold storage room and gathered some basic medical supplies. Thermal blankets, some medications that might help with hypothermia, a few energy bars from my emergency kit. Then I made my way to the main entrance on the 1st floor. The group was waiting outside the glass doors when I got there. Up close, they looked even worse than they had from my window. Most of them were clearly suffering from exposure. Blue lips, violent shivering, that glassy look in their eyes that meant their core body temperature was dangerously low. I unlocked the doors and they practically fell inside. "We need to get the worst cases warmed up gradually," I told them. "Too fast and you can cause cardiac arrest. Follow me." I led them to the employee break room on the second floor. It had large windows that would give us natural light during the day, and it was far enough from the morgue that people wouldn't panic about being in a building full of dead bodies. I started setting up a triage area using techniques I'd learned from forensic investigations of mass casualty events. The two worst cases were a woman in her 50s named Janet and an elderly man who introduced himself as Robert. Both were showing signs of moderate to severe hypothermia. Confusion, slurred speech, loss of fine motor control. Without intervention, they'd be unconscious within a few hours. I wrapped them in thermal blankets and started them on warm, non-caffeinated fluids. The key with hypothermia is gradual rewarming. You can't just throw someone in a hot bath. You have to raise their core temperature slowly, monitoring for cardiac complications the whole time. While I worked on the medical emergencies, I talked to the other survivors. The tall man in the business suit was named David. He'd been at his office downtown when the ash started falling and had tried to walk home. His car was buried under 3 feet of ash by the time he got to it. There was a young woman named Lisa who'd been a nursing student before everything went wrong. She'd been trying to get to the hospital where she did her clinical rotations, but the roads were impassable. A middle-aged couple, Tom and Maria, had been visiting Chicago from Wisconsin when Yellowstone erupted. Their hotel had lost power and heat, so they'd been wandering the streets looking for shelter. In total, there were 12 people in that break room, all of them looking to me for guidance. I realized that my medical knowledge and access to this secure building had made me the de facto leader of this group. It was a responsibility I wasn't sure I wanted, but I didn't have much choice. Over the next few hours, I shared what I knew about survival in extreme cold conditions, how to recognize the stages of hypothermia, how to maintain core body temperature, how to ration food and water effectively. Most importantly, I explained that we were probably looking at a long-term survival situation, not a temporary emergency. The ash cloud from Yellowstone is going to affect global weather patterns, I told them. We're talking about months, maybe years of abnormally cold temperatures, crop failures, infrastructure breakdowns, social collapse. This building is secure and we have some resources, but we need to start thinking about long-term sustainability. That's when the reality of our situation really started to sink in for everyone. This wasn't a 3-day power outage. This was the end of the world as we knew it. David asked the question that everyone was thinking. What about the government? FEMA, the National Guard, somebody's got to be organizing rescue efforts. I'd been monitoring my emergency radio throughout the morning. Most of the official channels had gone silent. The few broadcasts I could still receive were automated emergency messages telling people to stay indoors and await further instructions. But there were no further instructions coming. "I think we're on our own," I told them. Around mid-afternoon, Janet took a turn for the worse. Despite my efforts to gradually rewarm her, her core temperature wasn't stabilizing. Her breathing was becoming shallow and irregular. I'd seen this pattern before in hypothermia cases that came into the morgue. Her body was shutting down. I pulled David and Lisa aside and explained the situation. "She's not responding to treatment. Her age and the amount of exposure she suffered before we got her inside, I don't think her body can recover from this level of hypothermia." David looked stricken. "Isn't there something else you can do? Some medication, some procedure?" I thought about the advanced medical equipment back at the hospital where I'd done my residency. Cardiac monitors, heated IV fluids, specialized rewarming techniques. But all of that required infrastructure we no longer had. In a normal situation with full hospital resources maybe, but here, with what we have available, I've done everything I can. Janet died just before sunset. It was peaceful, as these things go. Her family was with her. Lisa held her hand while David talked to her quietly, even though she was probably unconscious by then. I monitored her vital signs until they stopped. It was the first death I'd witnessed as a living, breathing person rather than as a forensic pathologist examining remains after the fact. The emotional impact was completely different. This wasn't a case study or a medical mystery to solve. This was a person who'd been talking to me a few hours earlier, who'd had hopes of surviving this catastrophe and getting back to her life. After Janet died, I had to make another difficult decision. What to do with the body? In normal circumstances, there would be funeral homes, morgues, established procedures for handling human remains. But those systems had collapsed along with everything else. I explained to the group that we needed to move Janet's body to the cold storage room downstairs. It wasn't pleasant to think about, but it was the most sanitary and respectful option we had. The refrigeration units were still working on backup power, and it would prevent decomposition and potential health hazards. Some people were uncomfortable with the idea of staying in a building with dead bodies, but David backed me up. "Dr. Ashworth is right," he said. "We need to think practically about these things now." That evening, we held a brief memorial service for Janet in the break room. People shared memories of the few hours they'd known her, talked about her determination to survive, her concern for the other members of the group even when she was suffering herself. It helped everyone process what had happened and what we were facing, but I could see the fear in their eyes. If Janet could die despite having shelter and medical attention, what did that mean for the rest of us? How many more would we lose before this was over? I tried my radio again that night and managed to pick up a weak signal from what sounded like a ham radio operator somewhere in Wisconsin. He was broadcasting survival tips, sharing information about which areas still had power or working communication systems. Most importantly, he confirmed what I already suspected. The government response was completely overwhelmed. Most major cities were on their own. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. Denver had been completely cut off for over 24 hours now. No communication in or out. The ash fall there had been so severe that it had essentially buried the entire metro area. Military reconnaissance flights couldn't even get through the ash cloud to assess the situation. Emma and Sarah were in that blackout zone. If they were still alive, there was no way for me to know it. No way to contact them, no way to help them. For the first time since this whole thing started, I felt completely helpless. I shared the radio information with the group the next morning. Not the part about Denver, I wasn't ready to talk about that yet, but the general situation. The breakdown of government services, the widespread power failures, the fact that we were essentially cut off from the outside world. "So what's our plan?" Lisa asked. She'd been helpful with the medical aspects of our situation, and I was starting to think of her as my second in command. "We consolidate resources, establish routines, and prepare for a long siege," I said. "This building has advantages. It's secure, it has some backup power, and I know where all the supplies are stored. But we need to be smart about rationing, and we need to stay healthy." Over the next several hours, we organized ourselves into something resembling a functional survival group. David took charge of inventory and resource management. Lisa handled basic medical care under my supervision. Tom and Maria, who had some camping experience, worked on improving our heating and insulation situation. But I was already thinking about bigger challenges ahead. Our food would run out eventually. The backup power wouldn't last forever, and winter was coming. Even in a normal year, Chicago winters were brutal. With the volcanic ash blocking sunlight and dropping global temperatures, this winter was going to be unlike anything in recorded history. Late that afternoon, we heard voices outside again. This time, they sounded different, more organized, more aggressive. I looked out the window and saw a group of maybe 8 people methodically checking every building on our block. They were dressed in heavy winter gear, and they were moving with purpose. I watched them for several minutes. Unlike our group of desperate survivors, these people looked like they knew what they were doing. They had backpacks, proper cold weather equipment, and what looked like weapons. Not guns, but knives, crowbars, tools that could be used to break into buildings or defend themselves. One of them was pointing at our building and talking to the others. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language suggested they were planning something. I went back to the break room and quietly explained the situation to David and Lisa. We might have a problem. There's another group outside and they look like they're planning to force their way into the building. David looked worried. How many people? 8 that I could see. They're better equipped than we are and they look like they've been doing this for a while. Scavenging, taking what they need from abandoned buildings. Lisa asked the question I was dreading. What do we do if they try to get in? I thought about the building's layout, the security features, the possible entry points. The medical examiner's office was designed to be secure, but it wasn't a fortress. Determined people with the right tools could probably get inside eventually. We have some advantages, I said. We know the building layout better than they do. We have higher ground, and we have something they probably don't expect. What's that? David asked. I thought about my 18 years of forensic experience. All those crime scenes I'd examined, all those cases of violence and death I'd studied. I'd never been the one causing the violence, but I understood it in ways most people didn't. I knew human anatomy, I knew where people were vulnerable, I knew how bodies failed under stress. I know how people die, I said. And sometimes, in a situation like this, that knowledge becomes useful in ways I never expected. The group outside was getting closer to our building. I could see them testing doors, looking for weak points in the security. We had maybe an hour before they found a way inside. That's when I realized my 18 years with the dead weren't just going to help me survive the cold and the hunger. They were going to help me protect the people who were counting on me to keep them alive. My knowledge of death was about to become my expertise in preventing it. The group outside was getting more systematic in their approach. I watched them from my office window as they worked their way around the building, testing every door and first-floor window. They weren't random scavengers. These people had done this before. They knew how to case a building, how to find weak points, how to get inside when they wanted something. I gathered our group in the break room and explained what we were facing. They're going to find a way in eventually. The building is secure, but it's not impenetrable. We need to decide how we're going to handle this. Tom, the middle-aged man from Wisconsin, suggested we try to reason with them. Maybe they just want shelter like we did. Maybe we can share the space. I understood his optimism, but my forensic experience had taught me to read human behavior differently. Look, in my line of work, I've seen what people do when they're desperate. When normal social rules break down, when survival becomes the only priority, people change. They become capable of things they never thought possible. David seemed to understand what I was getting at. You think they're dangerous. I think they're survivors, which means they've already made hard choices to get this far. They might be willing to make harder choices to take what we have. Lisa asked the practical question. So what do we do? I thought about the building's layout, our resources, our advantages and disadvantages. We have better knowledge of the building. We have medical supplies they probably need. And we have higher ground. If they do get inside, we can control the engagement. Over the next hour, I laid out a defensive plan based on principles I'd learned from crime scene analysis. Most violent encounters follow predictable patterns. People move in predictable ways, they make predictable mistakes, and they have predictable vulnerabilities. We moved our supplies to the 4th floor, near my office. If the intruders got inside, they'd have to come up the stairwells to reach us, which would give us advance warning and force them into a confined space. I positioned people at strategic points where they could observe the approaches and communicate with each other. But I also prepared for the possibility that diplomacy might work. Maybe Tom was right. Maybe these were just desperate people looking for shelter, and we could find a way to coexist. I decided to try talking to them first. I opened my office window and called down to their leader, a stocky man in his 40s wearing military-style winter gear. Hey, you looking for shelter? This is a secure building, but we've got people inside already. He looked up at me with calculating eyes. "How many people you got up there?" 12. "We're not looking for trouble, just trying to survive like everyone else." 12 people in a building this size. He seemed skeptical. "You got food?" "Medical supplies." I made a decision to be partially honest. "Some. Not enough for a large group, but we're managing." He conferred with his people for a few minutes, then called back up to me. "We're coming in. You can let us in peaceful like, or we can find our own way. Either way, we're coming in." That told me everything I needed to know about their intentions. This wasn't a request for shelter. This was a takeover. "I'm sorry, but we can't accommodate more people right now," I called down. "We barely have enough resources for the group we've got." His response was exactly what I expected. "That's not really your choice anymore, friend." I closed the window and went back to our group. "They're coming in whether we like it or not. Everyone needs to get to the positions we discussed." What happened next tested everything I'd learned about human nature in 18 years of forensic work. The intruders found a way into the building through a loading dock in the basement. I heard them moving around on the lower floors, systematically searching each room. They were methodical, professional. These weren't panicked refugees. These were people who'd been taking what they wanted from other survivors. Around 8 that evening, they found the stairwell to the upper floors. I could hear their footsteps echoing as they climbed toward us. I'd positioned David and Tom at the third-floor landing to serve as lookouts. When they reported that the intruders were heading up, I knew we were past the point of peaceful resolution. The leader, who I'd later learn was named Marcus, reached the fourth floor with 3 of his people. The rest stayed below, probably securing their escape route and making sure we couldn't get past them. Smart tactical thinking. "Dr. Ashworth," Marcus called out as they reached our floor. "That's you up there, right? The guy I was talking to from the window." "That's right," I called back from my office. "What do you want?" "I want to have a civilized conversation about sharing resources. This is a big building, plenty of room for everyone." I knew from his tone that this wasn't going to be a negotiation. This was going to be an ultimatum. But I also knew something he didn't. I understood the layout of this floor better than anyone. I knew where the blind spots were, where someone could hide, where the advantage shifted from attacker to defender. "All right," I said. "Let's talk." I stepped out of my office with my hands visible, no weapons, trying to project calm confidence. Marcus and his people were standing near the elevator bank, about 30 feet away. Close enough to talk, far enough that they'd have to cross open ground to reach me. "Here's the situation," Marcus said. "You've got medical supplies we need. You've got food and water we need. You've got a warm, secure building we need. We're prepared to let you stay, but things are going to work differently now." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means I make the decisions about resource allocation. It means my people get priority when it comes to food, heat, medical care. It means you do what I tell you to do." I'd examined crime scenes like this before. Home invasions, robberies, situations where criminals took control of a location and the people in it. The psychology was always the same. Establish dominance, eliminate resistance, exploit resources until they were gone, then move on. "And if we don't agree to those terms?" I asked. Marcus smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Then we take what we need anyway, and you don't get to stay." That's when I realized we'd reached the point I'd been dreading. Violence was inevitable. The only question was whether we were going to be victims or survivors. "I need to discuss this with my people," I said. "You've got 5 minutes." I went back into my office where Lisa and 2 others were waiting. "He's not negotiating," I told them quietly. "He's taking over. If we let this happen, we become his prisoners until he decides we're not useful anymore." Lisa looked terrified. "What choice do we have? They've got weapons, they've got more people. They've got advantages, but so do we. We know this building. We know where the medical supplies are stored, where the backup power controls are, where the emergency exits are. Most importantly, we know something they don't." "What's that?" I thought about the cold storage room 4 floors below us, about the 43 bodies still preserved in their refrigerated drawers. About the knowledge I'd gained from 18 years of studying how people die. I know exactly how to stop them if I have to. When I went back out to face Marcus, I had a counterproposal ready. Here's what I'm willing to do. We'll share the building, but we maintain separate areas. You take the first and second floors, we keep the third and fourth. We'll share medical knowledge and emergency resources, but we manage our own food and water. Marcus laughed. You're not in a position to negotiate, Doc. You're going to do what I tell you to do. Actually, I think you're misunderstanding something important about our situation here. Yeah, what's that? I looked at him carefully, using the same analytical skills I applied to crime scene evidence. Mid-40s, good physical condition, confident in his ability to intimidate people, but also showing signs of stress and fatigue. He'd been surviving in this environment for days, making hard decisions, probably using violence to get what he needed. That kind of pressure changes people, makes them more aggressive but also more reckless. This isn't just an office building, I said. This is the Cook County Medical Examiner's office. Do you know what that means? His expression changed slightly. You're the morgue guy, so what? So I've spent 18 years studying violent death. I know exactly how the human body fails under stress. I know where people are vulnerable, how much damage different types of trauma cause, how long it takes for various injuries to incapacitate someone. I let that sink in for a moment. I've never applied that knowledge in a violent situation before, but I'm starting to think this might be the time to learn. Marcus's confidence wavered just a bit. He probably expected me to be intimidated by his threats. He didn't expect to be threatened back by someone who spoke about violence with clinical detachment. You threatening me, Doc? I'm explaining the situation. You want the resources in this building. You're going to have to take them from someone who understands death better than anyone you've ever met. Your choice. What happened next was a test of wills. Marcus was trying to decide if I was bluffing, and I was trying to project enough confidence to make him think twice about using violence. In my peripheral vision, I could see David and Tom emerging from the stairwell behind Marcus's group. They'd circled around using the back stairs, just like we'd planned. Here's a better idea, I continued. You and your people are obviously experienced survivors. We could use that knowledge. We've got medical expertise and a secure location. Instead of taking from each other, maybe we pool our resources and increase everyone's chances of getting through this. For a moment, I thought it might work. Marcus seemed to be considering the possibility of cooperation instead of conquest. But then one of his people, a younger man with wild eyes and obvious signs of stimulant use, stepped forward. "Forget this diplomatic garbage," he said. "Let's just take what we came for and get out of here." That's when everything went wrong. The young man pulled a knife and started moving toward me. Marcus tried to stop him, but it was too late. The situation had escalated beyond anyone's control. I'd never been in a knife fight before, but I'd examined dozens of stab wound victims. I knew the most common attack patterns, the typical defensive wounds, the angles and depths that caused fatal versus non-fatal injuries. When the attacker lunged at me, my 18 years of forensic training took over. I sidestepped his initial thrust and grabbed his wrist, using knowledge of joint mechanics I'd learned from examining fracture patterns in assault victims. A sharp twist in the right direction, and I felt his radius bone snap. The knife clattered to the floor. The fight lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it changed everything. Marcus's other people backed away when they saw their colleague writhing on the floor with a compound fracture. They'd expected to intimidate a mild-mannered doctor, not fight someone who understood human anatomy well enough to disable an attacker with surgical precision. "Jesus Christ," Marcus said, staring at his injured man. "What did you do to him?" "Spiral fracture of the radius, probably some ligament damage in the wrist," I said, returning to my clinical tone. "He'll need medical attention soon, or he might lose function in that hand permanently." That's when Marcus made his next mistake. Instead of de-escalating, instead of accepting that this had gone too far, he doubled down. He pulled his own weapon, a hunting knife with a 6-inch blade. You're going to fix him up, and then you're going to give us what we came for." I looked at the injured man, who was going into shock from pain and blood loss. Then I looked at Marcus, who was clearly committed to violence now. Finally, I looked at the knife in his hand and calculated angles, reach, probable attack patterns. "Marcus," I said quietly, "you should know something about that knife you're holding." "What's that?" "In 18 years of forensic work, I've seen maybe 300 stab wound cases. I know exactly what damage that blade will cause depending on where and how you use it. I also know that most people who threaten others with knives have never actually used them in a fight." I took a step closer to him. "But I've spent my entire career studying the aftermath of knife violence. I know things about cutting and stabbing that you've never even thought about." Marcus was starting to look uncertain. His injured teammate was making increasingly desperate sounds, and David and Tom had positioned themselves to cut off his escape route. "So here's what's going to happen," I continued. "You're going to put that knife down. I'm going to treat your friend's injury because that's what I do. And then you're all going to leave this building and find somewhere else to set up camp. And if we don't," I thought about my emergency kit, about the surgical instruments I'd gathered from the medical supply rooms. Scalpels, bone saws, forceps, tools designed for precision cutting and tissue manipulation. In the right hands, with the right knowledge, they could be more effective than any weapon Marcus was carrying. Then you're going to discover that there's a big difference between someone who threatens violence and someone who understands it. Marcus looked at his injured teammate, then at David and Tom blocking his escape route, then back at me. I could see him calculating odds, assessing risks, trying to decide if this was worth the potential cost. Finally, he put the knife down. "All right, Doc, you win this round. But this isn't over." I treated the injured man's fracture using techniques I'd learned from examining similar injuries in autopsy cases. Temporary stabilization, pain management, basic wound care. It wasn't definitive treatment, but it would keep him functional until they could find proper medical facilities. While I worked, Marcus made one last attempt at intimidation. "You can't stay holed up in this building forever. Eventually, you're going to have to venture outside, and when you do, we'll be waiting." I finished wrapping the splint and looked up at him. "Marcus, let me explain something about our respective situations. You're nomadic. You move from place to place, taking what you need, always looking for the next score. That makes you vulnerable because you never know what you're walking into." I gestured around us. "I'm in a fortress that I know better than anyone. I have medical supplies, tools, and 18 years of knowledge about how to use them. If you want to make this a war, you should understand that I have every possible advantage." After they left, our group gathered in the break room to process what had happened. Everyone was shaken by the violence, by how quickly the situation had escalated, by the realization that we might have to defend ourselves again. Lisa was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. "Is this what survival looks like now? Fighting other people for resources?" I thought about the crime scenes I'd investigated over the years. Domestic violence cases where ordinary people became killers under stress. Gang territories where violence was routine. Murder-suicides where desperation overcame everything else. "Maybe," I said. "When civilization breaks down, when people get desperate enough, violence becomes a tool for survival. We can hope it doesn't come to that, but we need to be prepared for the possibility." David asked the practical question. "Do you think they'll come back?" "Maybe. Probably not immediately. Marcus isn't stupid. He knows we're prepared now, and he knows I'm not the easy target he thought I was. But eventually, if they get desperate enough, they might try again." That night, I established a watch schedule and taught everyone basic principles of building security: where to position observers, how to communicate quietly, what to do if they spotted intruders. I also made a hard decision about our defensive capabilities. I went down to the morgue and selected several surgical instruments from our inventory: scalpels, bone saws, dissection tools. In the right hands, with the right knowledge of human anatomy, These could be more effective than conventional weapons. I didn't like thinking about using them that way, but Marcus had made it clear that pacifism might not be an option. Over the next several hours, I found myself thinking about Emma and Sarah more than I had since this whole thing started. The radio reports from Denver were getting worse. Complete communication blackout, infrastructure collapse, no sign of organized rescue efforts. If they were alive, they were facing the same kinds of desperate situations we were dealing with here. But there was nothing I could do to help them from Chicago. My responsibility now was to the people who were counting on me to keep them alive. The group that had formed around my medical knowledge and my access to this secure building. Around 3 in the morning, I tried my emergency radio again and picked up a new signal. A ham radio operator in Milwaukee was broadcasting survival information and coordinating between different groups of survivors. He confirmed what I already suspected about the broader situation. Government services had essentially collapsed across the Midwest. The National Guard was overwhelmed and couldn't respond to civilian emergencies. Most major cities were cut off from outside help. Local law enforcement had either abandoned their posts or were dealing with their own survival crises. But he also shared some hope. There were organized survivor communities forming in rural areas, places with better access to food production and renewable energy. Some cities were establishing refugee centers in large, defensible buildings. People were adapting, organizing, finding ways to survive and even help each other. The message was clear. We weren't alone in this, but we also couldn't count on anyone else to save us. Survival was going to depend on our own resources, our own planning, and our own willingness to do whatever was necessary to stay alive. I shared this information with the group the next morning. The reality that government help wasn't coming was hard for people to accept, but it also clarified our situation. We were on our own for the foreseeable future. "So what's our long-term plan?" David asked. I thought about our resources, our location, our capabilities. We secure this building permanently. We establish sustainable routines for food, water, heat, and medical care. We prepare for the possibility that we might be here for months, maybe longer. And if more groups like Marcus show up, I looked around at the people who were counting on me to keep them alive. Lisa with her nursing knowledge, David with his organizational skills, Tom and Maria with their practical experience, all of them looking to me for answers because my medical expertise had made me their leader. Then we defend what we've built. And if necessary, we use every advantage we have to make sure we're the ones who survive. My 18 years with the dead had taught me that survival often comes down to being willing to do things that civilized people find unthinkable. I was starting to understand that my knowledge of death might be the thing that kept all of us alive. The next 18 hours passed quietly, but I knew Marcus wasn't finished with us. People like him don't back down from confrontation. They just regroup and plan better approaches. I spent the time teaching our group more advanced defensive techniques and preparing for what I was becoming convinced would be another assault. Lisa had been asking questions about my medical background, particularly my forensic training. "You handled that situation with Marcus differently than I expected," she said while we were organizing medical supplies. "Most doctors I know would have tried to de-escalate or find a peaceful solution. Most doctors work in functioning hospitals with security guards and police backup," I replied. "When you spend 18 years examining the aftermath of violence, you learn that sometimes peaceful solutions aren't possible. Sometimes survival requires understanding how to end threats definitively." I was in the process of explaining basic anatomy to David and Tom, showing them pressure points and vulnerable areas that could incapacitate an attacker without causing permanent damage, when we heard vehicles outside, multiple engines, moving slowly through the ash-covered streets. From my office window, I could see 3 pickup trucks positioning themselves around our building. This wasn't the same small group from before. Marcus had brought reinforcements. I counted at least 15 people, and they were moving with military-style coordination. "Everyone to positions," I called out. We'd established a defensive plan based on the building's layout. Observers at key windows, communication between floors, and fallback positions if they breached our perimeter. But as I watched them deploy around the building, I realized this was different from their previous attempt. They weren't trying to break in immediately. They were setting up a siege. Marcus appeared at the main entrance with a battery-powered megaphone. "Dr. Ashworth, we need to talk. Come to the front window where I can see you." I made my way to the lobby-level window and looked down at him. He was flanked by 8 armed individuals, and I could see more positioned around the building's perimeter. "Here's the new situation," Marcus announced through the megaphone. "We've got this building surrounded. We've got enough people to maintain watch around the clock. We know you've got limited food and water up there, and we can wait longer than you can." This was smart tactical thinking. Instead of risking another confrontation like the one that had injured his teammate, Marcus was planning to starve us out, force us to surrender by making our position untenable. "What do you want?" I called down. "Same thing as before. Access to your medical supplies and this secure building. But now we're doing this the easy way. You come down and surrender, we'll let your people live. You try to hold out, and eventually we take this place anyway after you're too weak to resist." I considered our resources. We had maybe 4 days of food left if we rationed carefully. Water for perhaps a week, assuming the building's plumbing continued working. Marcus probably knew these numbers roughly. He'd been inside, he'd seen our setup. But he was making assumptions about our capabilities that might not be accurate. "I need time to discuss this with my people," I called down. "You've got 2 hours. Then we start making things uncomfortable for you." I went back to the group and explained the situation. The siege tactics, the timeline, the impossible choice between surrender and starvation. Everyone looked to me for solutions, but I was beginning to think our options were extremely limited. That's when David made a suggestion that changed everything. "What about the basement levels? You said this building has multiple sub-levels for storage and utilities. Could we get out through there?" I'd been so focused on defending our position that I hadn't considered escape routes. The medical examiner's building did have extensive basement areas, storage rooms, utility systems, and an old tunnel system that connected to the neighboring buildings for shared infrastructure. "There's a maintenance tunnel that runs under the street," I said, thinking out loud. "It connects to the utility systems for the whole block. If we could get into that tunnel system, we might be able to emerge in one of the other buildings." Lisa looked hopeful for the first time in hours. "Could we get everyone out that way?" "Maybe, but it would mean abandoning all our supplies, all our advantages. Once we're outside this building, we're just another group of refugees trying to survive in a frozen city." Tom raised the question I'd been avoiding. "What about the long term? Even if we escape Marcus, where do we go? How do we survive without shelter and medical supplies?" That's when I remembered the radio broadcasts I'd been monitoring. The ham radio operator in Milwaukee had mentioned organized survivor communities, places where people were pooling resources and establishing sustainable operations. But most of these communities were outside the major cities, in rural areas with better access to food production and renewable energy. "There might be options," I said. "I've been hearing radio chatter about survivor communities forming in rural Wisconsin, maybe southern Illinois, places where people are trying to rebuild some kind of sustainable infrastructure." "How far?" David asked. "150 to 200 miles, depending on which community and which route we take." The group fell silent as everyone contemplated what that meant. 200 miles through frozen, ash-covered terrain with minimal supplies and no transportation. It sounded like suicide, but Marcus had made one critical error in his siege planning. He was assuming we were trapped, that our only options were surrender or starvation. He didn't know about my 18 years of forensic experience, about the tools and knowledge I had access to in this building. "There's another option," I said quietly, "one that Marcus isn't expecting." "What's that?" Lisa asked. I thought about the surgical instruments I'd gathered from the medical supply rooms, about the detailed anatomical knowledge I'd gained from thousands of autopsies, about the understanding of human psychology I'd developed from studying crime scenes and violent death. We end this siege permanently. The words hung in the air for a long moment. Everyone understood what I was suggesting, but no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge it. Finally, David spoke up. "You're talking about killing them. I'm talking about survival. Marcus has made it clear that coexistence isn't possible. He's going to keep escalating until he either takes what he wants or eliminates us as a threat. The only way to stop him is to remove his capability to threaten us." Lisa looked horrified. "We're not killers, we're just trying to survive." "That's exactly what we are," I replied. "Survivors. And sometimes survival requires doing things that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances." I explained my analysis of the tactical situation. Marcus had spread his people around the building's perimeter, which gave them coverage, but also isolated them from each other. They were expecting us to either surrender or try to escape. They weren't prepared for an offensive action. I know this building better than anyone. I know where the blind spots are, where someone could move without being seen. I have tools and knowledge that they don't expect me to use. Most importantly, I understand human anatomy well enough to incapacitate or eliminate threats efficiently and quietly. Tom asked the question that everyone was thinking. "And you're willing to do that? To actually kill people?" I thought about Emma and Sarah, somewhere in the Denver disaster zone, possibly dead, possibly fighting for survival just like we were. I thought about Janet, who died despite our efforts to save her. I thought about the responsibility I felt for the 11 people who were counting on me to keep them alive. "Yes," I said. "If that's what it takes to protect this group, yes." What I was proposing went against everything I'd been trained to believe about medical ethics, about the value of human life, about using knowledge to heal rather than harm. But 18 years of forensic work had also taught me that the world contains people who choose violence, people who prey on others, people who will kill to get what they want. Marcus was one of those people, and the only way to stop someone like that is to be willing to meet violence with superior violence. I spent the next hour developing a tactical plan based on crime scene analysis and forensic knowledge. Marcus had positioned his people in predictable patterns around the building. Sentries at the corners, pairs watching the main entrances, a command post near the vehicles. Standard defensive positioning, but it created opportunities for someone who understood the building's layout and the psychology of siege warfare. The key was the maintenance tunnel system, not for escape, but for access. The tunnels connected to utility rooms in the basement, and those utility rooms had access points throughout the building. Someone who knew the building's infrastructure could move between floors without using the main stairwells. More importantly, someone with medical knowledge could approach sentries from behind and incapacitate them before they could raise an alarm. A properly applied carotid artery compression would cause unconsciousness in seconds. Knowledge of spinal anatomy could ensure that unconsciousness became permanent if necessary. I gathered my surgical instruments and explained the plan to David and Lisa. They would maintain communication with the sentries Marcus had positioned outside, making it appear that we were still trapped on the 4th floor. Meanwhile, I would use the building's internal infrastructure to eliminate his perimeter guards one by one. "This is insane," Lisa said. "You're not a soldier, you're a doctor." "I'm a forensic pathologist who spent 18 years studying violent death," I corrected her. "I know exactly how the human body fails under different types of trauma. I know where people are vulnerable, how much force is required to cause incapacitation versus permanent damage, how to approach someone without being detected. But knowing about violence and actually committing violence are completely different things." She was right, of course. I'd never killed anyone. I'd never even been in a serious fight before the incident with Marcus's knife-wielding associate. But I'd examined the aftermath of thousands of violent encounters. I understood the mechanics, the psychology, the anatomy of lethal force. Maybe, I said, but Marcus has given us a choice between surrendering everything we've built or fighting for the right to survive. I'm choosing to fight. Around 10 that evening, I made my move. Using the maintenance tunnel system, I accessed the basement utility room and began working my way through the building's internal infrastructure. The electrical conduits, water pipes, and ventilation systems created pathways that Marcus's people couldn't monitor from outside. My first target was a sentry positioned near the building's east entrance. He was standing in the shadows, trying to stay warm while maintaining visual coverage of the approach routes. Perfect positioning for his tactical mission, but it also meant he was isolated from his teammates. I emerged from a basement access point about 30 feet behind his position. The ash fall had reduced visibility to maybe 50 feet, and the constant background noise of wind and settling debris masked any sounds I might make approaching. 18 years of forensic training had taught me exactly where to apply pressure to interrupt blood flow to the brain. A properly executed sleeper hold would cause unconsciousness in less than 10 seconds. Hold it longer, and it became lethal as brain tissue died from oxygen deprivation. The sentry never saw me coming. One moment he was scanning the approaches to the building. The next moment he was unconscious on the ground. I checked his pulse and breathing. Still alive, but he'd be out for at least 20 minutes, long enough for me to deal with his teammates. I repeated this process 3 more times over the next hour. Each sentry was positioned to watch for external threats, not for someone emerging from inside the building they thought they had under siege. Each time, I used medical knowledge to apply exactly the right amount of force to incapacitate without killing. But when I reached the command post near the vehicles, the situation became more complicated. Marcus was there with 5 other people, including the man whose arm I'd broken in our previous encounter. They were huddled around a propane heater, planning their next move and monitoring communications with their sentries. Except their sentries weren't responding anymore. "Johnson, report," Marcus was saying into a handheld radio. "Johnson, do you copy?" Silence. "Martinez, what's your status?" More silence. I could see Marcus starting to realize that something was wrong. He was sending one of his people to check on the missing sentries, which meant my window of opportunity was closing rapidly. That's when I made a decision that would have been unthinkable 48 hours earlier. I had a surgical scalpel in my hand, a tool designed for precise cutting in medical procedures. But I also knew from forensic experience exactly where and how to use it to cause rapid blood loss and incapacitation. The femoral artery, the carotid artery, specific locations where a small cut could cause unconsciousness in seconds and death in minutes. Marcus was focused on his radio communications, trying to re-establish contact with his perimeter guards. The person he'd sent to investigate had their back to me, moving toward the building entrance. The others were clustered around the heater, not watching their surroundings. I moved. The attack lasted maybe 15 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. I approached from the blind spot behind their vehicle, using automotive cover to get within striking distance. The first target was the investigator heading toward the building. A precise cut to the femoral artery, and he collapsed from blood loss before he could call out. Marcus turned at the sound, but by then I was already moving toward the group around the heater. 2 more quick strikes, targeting major blood vessels, and suddenly Marcus was facing a medical professional who understood human anatomy well enough to kill efficiently and quietly. "Jesus Christ," Marcus said, backing away from me. "What have you done?" "I've eliminated your tactical advantage," I replied, maintaining the same clinical tone I used during autopsies. "Your perimeter guards are unconscious. 3 of your assault team are bleeding out. You're outnumbered and outpositioned." The remaining 2 members of his group were looking between Marcus and me, trying to decide whether to fight or run. I could see the calculation in their eyes. They'd expected to intimidate a group of frightened civilians, not fight someone who moved like a predator and spoke about violence with detached professionalism. "You're insane," Marcus said. "You're a doctor. You're supposed to save lives, not take them." "I'm a forensic pathologist," I corrected him. "I study death for a living, and right now I'm studying yours." That's when Marcus made his final mistake. Instead of retreating, instead of accepting that he'd lost this confrontation, he pulled his hunting knife and charged at me. But I'd been expecting that reaction. 18 years of studying crime scenes had taught me that violent criminals often escalate when their plans fail, that they make predictable choices under stress. I was ready for his attack. The fight was over in seconds. Marcus was bigger and stronger than me, but I understood human anatomy in ways he couldn't comprehend. I knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage with minimum effort. When he lunged with his knife, I sidestepped and used a scalpel to sever the tendons in his wrist. When he tried to tackle me, I targeted pressure points that caused instant paralysis. Marcus collapsed, unable to move his arms or legs, bleeding from precisely placed cuts that would be fatal without immediate medical intervention. "You have maybe 10 minutes before blood loss causes irreversible shock," I told him. "Your choice: call off your remaining people and I'll treat your injuries. Keep fighting and you die here in the parking lot." He looked up at me with a mixture of fear and respect. "You really are insane." "No," I said. "I'm just someone who's willing to do whatever it takes to protect the people counting on me to keep them alive." Marcus used his radio to call off his remaining forces. Within minutes, the siege was over. His surviving people loaded the wounded into their vehicles and disappeared into the ash-covered night, leaving us in control of our building once again. But as I stood in that parking lot, looking at the blood on my hands and the surgical instruments I'd used as weapons, I realized that something fundamental had changed. I was no longer the mild-mannered forensic pathologist who'd started this ordeal 48 hours ago. I'd become something harder, more dangerous, more willing to use extreme measures to ensure survival. My 18 years with the dead had taught me everything I needed to know about taking life as well as studying it. When I returned to the building, our group was waiting for me with a mixture of relief and horror. They were grateful that the siege was over, but they were also looking at me differently now. They'd seen what I was capable of when pushed to extremes. "Is it over?" Lisa asked. "For now," I said, "but Marcus was right about one thing. We can't stay here indefinitely. Eventually, someone else will come looking for what we have, and they might be better prepared than he was." So what do we do? I thought about the radio broadcasts, about the survivor communities forming in rural areas, about the 200-mile journey through frozen wasteland that might be our only chance for long-term survival. We start planning our exit. This building kept us alive for 48 hours, but it's not a permanent solution. If we want to survive long-term, we need to find people who are building something sustainable. David asked the question I'd been avoiding. "What about your daughter? What about Denver?" I looked out the window at the ash-covered city, at the apocalyptic landscape that had once been one of America's major metropolitan areas. Denver was 200 miles away through terrain that was becoming more dangerous every hour. Even if Emma and Sarah were alive, reaching them might be impossible. But staying here meant accepting that I'd never know what happened to them. It meant giving up the most important relationship in my life for the sake of protecting strangers who'd become my responsibility. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I know that sitting here waiting for rescue isn't going to help anyone. If we're going to survive, if we're going to have any chance of rebuilding our lives, we need to start moving towards something better than this." My 18 years with the dead had taught me that survival sometimes requires letting go of the past to secure the future. But as I looked at the faces of the people counting on me to lead them to safety, I wondered if I was strong enough to make that choice. The next few hours would test everything I'd learned about leadership, about survival, and about the price of staying alive when the world ends around you. The hours after Marcus's defeat were filled with difficult decisions and harsh realities. Our group had survived the siege, But the cost was becoming clear. We'd used violence to solve our immediate problem, but violence has a way of creating larger problems down the road. Word would spread about what happened here. Other groups would either avoid us out of fear or target us specifically because they saw us as a threat. I spent the early morning hours monitoring my emergency radio, trying to gather intelligence about the broader situation. The news was mixed. Some survivor communities were successfully establishing sustainable operations, but others were falling apart due to internal conflicts or external threats. The pattern was becoming clear. Groups that could defend themselves and make hard decisions were surviving. Groups that couldn't were being absorbed or eliminated. Around 6 in the morning, I picked up a transmission that changed everything. It was a ham radio operator broadcasting from somewhere in Wisconsin, coordinating between different survivor communities. But what caught my attention was a specific message he was relaying. Seeking information on Dr. Nolan Ashworth, forensic pathologist, last known location Chicago area. Family members attempting contact from Denver region survivor community. Respond on frequency 47.5 if you have information. I nearly dropped the radio. Emma and Sarah were alive. They'd made it to some kind of organized survivor community in the Denver area, and they were trying to find me. I immediately tuned to the specified frequency and made contact with the Wisconsin operator. "This is Dr. Nolan Ashworth. I'm broadcasting from Chicago. You said family members were trying to reach me from Denver." The operator's voice came back within minutes. "Dr. Ashworth, we've been trying to relay this message for the past 18 hours. Your daughter Emma and ex-wife Sarah are safe. They're with a survivor community that's been established at the Colorado Springs military installation. They've been trying to contact you since the initial eruption." The relief was overwhelming, but it was immediately followed by a more complex set of emotions. Emma and Sarah were alive, but they were at a military installation 200 miles away through some of the most dangerous terrain in the country. Getting to them would require crossing frozen wasteland, avoiding hostile survivor groups, and somehow covering that distance with limited supplies and no transportation. I shared this information with our group. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some people saw it as hope, proof that organized communities were forming, and that reunion with lost family members was possible. Others saw it as an impossible dream that would get us all killed if we attempted it. 200 miles through that, David said, gesturing toward the ash-covered landscape outside. We don't have vehicles, we don't have enough supplies, and we don't know what we'll encounter along the way. Lisa was more supportive. But if there are organized communities forming, if there are places where people are successfully rebuilding, then maybe that's where we need to go anyway. Maybe this is the direction we should be heading regardless. Tom raised the practical questions. What kind of timeline are we talking about? How long would a journey like that take on foot through these conditions? I'd been thinking about the logistics since I heard the radio transmission. Under normal conditions, maybe a week of hard walking. In these conditions, with ash-covered roads, freezing temperatures, and the need to find shelter every night, probably 2 weeks minimum. That assumes we can maintain an average of 15 miles per day and don't encounter major obstacles. What about supplies? Maria asked. We'd need food and water for 2 weeks, plus cold weather gear, medical supplies, tools, weapons for protection. I calculated our current resources against what we'd need for the journey. We had maybe 3 days of food left in the building. The medical supplies I'd gathered were extensive, but most of them were designed for stationary use, not field medicine. We had some cold weather clothing, but not enough for extended exposure to sub-freezing temperatures. We'd need to scavenge supplies along the way, I said. Plan the route to pass through towns and cities where we could resupply. But that also means increased risk of encounters with other survivor groups. The conversation continued for hours as we debated the merits and risks of attempting the journey. But I could see that the group was starting to split along predictable lines. People with family connections elsewhere wanted to risk the journey. People who'd found stability in our current situation wanted to stay put and hope for rescue or improved conditions. Around noon, we received another radio transmission that forced the decision. The Wisconsin operator was broadcasting emergency information about weather patterns. A massive storm system was developing, bringing temperatures that would drop below -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The storm was expected to hit the Chicago area within 72 hours and last for at least a week. That changes everything, I told the group. This building doesn't have the heating capacity to keep us alive in -20-degree weather without continuous power. The backup generators won't last a week, and we don't have enough fuel to maintain heat for that long. David looked grim. So we're looking at freezing to death if we stay, or freezing to death if we go. Maybe. But if we leave now, we have 72 hours to get ahead of the storm. If we can cover 50 or 60 miles before it hits, we might be able to find better shelter in a smaller town with intact infrastructure. Lisa asked the question that everyone was thinking. And if we can't? If we get caught in the open when that storm hits? I thought about the hypothermia cases I'd examined over the years, the progression from cold exposure to unconsciousness to death. In -20-degree weather, exposed to wind and precipitation, survival time would be measured in hours, not days. Then we die, I said simply. But staying here guarantees we die. At least moving gives us a chance. The decision was made by necessity rather than consensus. We couldn't survive the coming storm in our current location, so we had to risk the journey regardless of where we were going. The question became whether to head toward the survivor communities in Wisconsin, which were closer but unknown, or toward Colorado Springs where I knew Emma and Sarah were waiting. I made the choice based on radio intelligence I'd gathered over the past 48 hours. The Wisconsin communities were struggling with internal conflicts and resource shortages. Several had already collapsed or been overrun by hostile groups. But the Colorado Springs installation was military-controlled, which meant better security and more organized infrastructure. We're going to Colorado, I announced. It's a longer journey, but it's toward a more stable destination, and it gives me the chance to reunite with my family. Some members of the group weren't happy with that decision. David and Tom had been hoping to head north toward Wisconsin, but the approaching storm made extended debate impossible. We had maybe 18 hours to gather supplies, plan our route, and get out of Chicago before the weather made travel impossible. I spent those 18 hours applying everything I'd learned about crisis management and resource allocation. We stripped the building of anything useful: medical supplies, tools, emergency food, cold weather gear. I created a portable medical kit using surgical instruments and medications that could handle field emergencies. The route planning was complex. We needed to avoid major highways where other survivor groups might be operating, but we also needed to stay close enough to populated areas that we could resupply along the way. I plotted a course that would take us through smaller towns and rural areas, places that might have intact infrastructure but fewer people competing for resources. But I also had to prepare the group for realities they hadn't considered. 200 miles through post-apocalyptic terrain wasn't going to be a camping trip. We'd encounter other survivor groups, some friendly, some hostile. We'd face medical emergencies with limited resources. We'd have to make decisions about rationing supplies that could mean the difference between life and death for group members. There's something else you need to understand, I told them as we made final preparations. The knowledge that kept us alive in this building isn't going to be enough on the road. Out there, we're going to face situations where survival requires doing things that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. What do you mean? Lisa asked. I thought about Marcus and his group, about the violence I'd used to end the siege, about the surgical instruments I was packing that could serve as weapons if necessary. I mean that my 18 years studying death has taught me things about survival that go beyond medical knowledge. If we encounter hostile groups, If we have to fight for resources or defend ourselves, you need to understand that I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to get this group to safety." The group fell silent as they processed what I was telling them. They'd seen what I was capable of during the siege, but they were still thinking of me as a doctor who'd been forced into violence by extreme circumstances. They needed to understand that the person leading them toward Colorado was someone who'd fundamentally changed during our 48 hours in the medical examiner's building. "I'm not the same person who started this journey," I continued. "The man who used to examine crime scenes and write autopsy reports doesn't exist anymore. The person standing here now is someone who's willing to use every tool available, including knowledge of human anatomy and physiology, to ensure this group's survival." We left the medical examiner's building just after sunset, moving through ash-covered streets toward the city's southern edge. I'd chosen a route that would take us through industrial areas and suburban neighborhoods, avoiding downtown where larger survivor groups were likely to be operating. The temperature was already dropping as we walked, and the ash made breathing difficult even with improvised masks. But we made good progress for the first few hours, covering maybe 8 miles before we had to stop and find shelter for the night. I'd identified an abandoned gas station on the outskirts of the city as our first waypoint. It had a small convenience store with thick walls and a single entrance that could be easily defended. More importantly, it had some remaining supplies that we could add to our inventory. While the group rested, I established communication with the Colorado Springs community using my portable radio. Emma's voice came through the static like a miracle. "Dad, Dad, is that really you?" Hearing her voice after 48 hours of uncertainty nearly broke my composure. "Yeah, sweetheart, it's me. I'm alive. I'm coming to get you. Are you safe?" We heard reports about Chicago being completely cut off. "I'm safe for now. I'm with a group of survivors and we're heading your way. It's going to take us about 2 weeks to reach you, but we're going to make it." Emma's voice was shaking. "Dad, it's bad out here. Really bad. The people at this base, they're talking about complete societal collapse. They're saying it might be years before things get back to normal." "I know, sweetheart, but we're going to get through this. I've learned things about survival that I never thought I'd need to know. I'm going to get to you, and then we're going to figure out how to rebuild our lives." After ending the radio contact, I realized that our journey was about more than just reaching Colorado Springs. It was about proving that knowledge, preparation, and the willingness to make hard choices could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. My 18 years with the dead had given me tools that most people didn't have, and I was going to use every one of them to keep this group alive. The next morning brought news that changed our timeline. The storm system was moving faster than predicted. Instead of 72 hours, we had maybe 48 hours before it hit our area. That meant pushing harder, taking more risks, and possibly traveling through areas where we'd be exposed to hostile encounters. But it also meant that every hour of delay could be fatal. I made the decision to increase our daily mileage target from 15 miles to 25 miles, even though I knew that pace would be exhausting and potentially dangerous for some group members. "We're going to push hard for the next 2 days," I told everyone. "The storm is coming faster than expected, and our survival depends on getting ahead of it. That means longer days, shorter rest periods, and accepting some risks we might otherwise avoid." David asked about group members who might not be able to maintain that pace. "What if someone can't keep up? What if we have medical emergencies that slow us down?" It was the question I'd been dreading, but also the one that demonstrated how much my thinking had changed over the past 48 hours. In normal circumstances, the answer would be that we adjust the pace to accommodate everyone, that we don't leave people behind, that group cohesion takes priority over speed. But these weren't normal circumstances. We were facing a survival situation where the wrong decision could kill everyone. "We maintain the pace," I said. "We help anyone who's struggling, we share the load, we do everything we can to keep the group together. But if someone can't maintain the minimum speed necessary for group survival, then we have to make hard choices. You're talking about leaving people behind, Lisa said. I'm talking about making decisions based on maximizing the number of people who survive. Sometimes that means accepting that we can't save everyone. It was a brutal calculation, but it was based on 18 years of forensic work that had taught me how to analyze worst-case scenarios objectively. In mass casualty events, in disaster situations, in any crisis where resources are limited, survival often comes down to triage decisions that seem heartless but are necessary for the greater good. Over the next 36 hours, we covered 58 miles through increasingly difficult terrain. The ash was getting deeper as we moved away from Chicago, and the temperature was dropping steadily. We encountered two other survivor groups during that time, both of which were struggling with their own survival challenges. The first group was a family of 6 trying to reach relatives in Missouri. They were poorly equipped and already showing signs of severe hypothermia. I provided basic medical treatment and shared some of our supplies, but I also made it clear that we couldn't slow our pace to accommodate their needs. The second encounter was more problematic. A group of 12 people who'd been looting abandoned stores and houses for supplies. They weren't immediately hostile, but their leader made it clear that they expected us to share our resources or face consequences. I handled that situation using the same combination of medical knowledge and tactical thinking that had worked with Marcus. I demonstrated that our group was prepared for violence and capable of defending itself, while also offering limited cooperation that didn't compromise our mission. We can trade some medical supplies for cold weather gear, I told their leader. But we're not stopping and we're not sharing our food or water reserves. The negotiation was tense, but it ended peacefully. We traded antibiotics and basic medical equipment for additional winter clothing and some useful tools. Both groups benefited from the exchange, and we were able to continue our journey without conflict. But the encounter reinforced something I'd been thinking about throughout our journey. The skills that were keeping us alive weren't just medical knowledge or building security techniques. They were psychological skills, the ability to read other people's intentions and respond appropriately to threat situations. 18 years of forensic work had taught me to analyze crime scenes, to understand how violence unfolds, to read the signs that indicate when a situation is about to escalate. Those skills were proving just as valuable for avoiding conflict as they had been for ending it. By the second night, we'd reached a small town about 90 miles south of Chicago. The storm was maybe 12 hours behind us, and we needed substantial shelter to survive what was coming. I identified an abandoned school building that met our requirements. Solid construction, multiple rooms for sleeping areas, a cafeteria kitchen where we could prepare hot meals. Most importantly, the school had a working emergency generator and enough fuel to run it for several days. We could wait out the storm in relative comfort while planning the next phase of our journey. That night, I established radio contact with both the Colorado Springs community and the Wisconsin operator who'd been coordinating communications between survivor groups. The news was mixed but encouraging. Several communities were successfully weathering the crisis and beginning to establish sustainable operations. But the reports also confirmed that this wasn't a temporary emergency. The volcanic winter was going to last months, possibly years. The government's calling it a civilization-level event, the Wisconsin operator reported. Complete breakdown of supply chains, transportation networks, communication systems. They're estimating it could take a decade to rebuild basic infrastructure. I shared this information with our group, but I also tried to put it in perspective. That's the national picture, but there are communities that are adapting, that are finding ways to be self-sufficient. Colorado Springs is one of them. Our job is to get there and contribute to building something sustainable. Emma's voice came through the radio around midnight. "Dad, are you still okay? The weather reports are showing a massive storm heading through your area. "We're in good shelter, sweetheart. We should be safe until it passes. Then we'll be about halfway to you. How are you holding up? This can't be easy for you." I thought about everything that had happened over the past 48 hours. The violence, the leadership decisions, the transformation from mild-mannered forensic pathologist to someone capable of doing whatever was necessary for group survival. "I'm different than I was when this started," I told her. "I've learned things about myself and about survival that I never expected to learn, but I'm getting stronger, and I'm getting closer to you every day." The storm hit just before dawn, bringing temperatures down to -18 degrees and wind speeds that made travel impossible. But we were warm and safe in our school building, with enough supplies to last until conditions improved. During the 3 days we were storm-bound, I used the time to train our group in advanced survival techniques: how to recognize and treat hypothermia in field conditions, how to find and purify water sources, how to identify edible plants and safe food sources, how to navigate using basic tools when electronic systems failed. But I also spent time thinking about what we'd face during the second half of our journey. The easy part was behind us. We'd escaped Chicago, we'd gotten ahead of the storm, and we'd proven that our group could work together under extreme conditions. But the 110 miles between our current location and Colorado Springs would take us through territory where other survivor groups were likely to be more established and potentially more dangerous. I was particularly concerned about the approach to Colorado Springs itself. A military installation with resources and security would be attracting refugees from across the region. That meant competition for access, screening processes that might exclude some or all of our group, and the possibility that the military authorities might not honor family connections in their admission decisions. On the third morning, the storm finally passed, and we prepared to resume our journey. The landscape outside looked like an alien world. Everything was covered in snow and ash, creating a gray-white wasteland that stretched to the horizon. But the sun was shining for the first time in days, and temperatures were rising back towards survivable levels. "Next phase is going to be different," I told the group as we packed our gear. "We're heading into territory where other people have had time to establish themselves. That means we might encounter more organized resistance, better-equipped groups, and situations where negotiation isn't possible." "Are you saying we should expect more violence?" David asked. "I'm saying we should be prepared for anything. My job is to get everyone to Colorado Springs alive, and I'm going to use whatever methods are necessary to accomplish that mission." As we set out from the school building, I realized that our 48 hours in the medical examiner's building had been preparation for something much larger. The knowledge I'd gained from 18 years with the dead, the leadership skills I'd developed under pressure, the willingness to make hard decisions that others couldn't make, all of it was leading toward this moment. I had 110 miles to prove that survival was possible, that communities could be rebuilt, that families could be reunited even when the world ended around them. My 18 years with the dead were about to teach me everything I needed to know about preserving life in a world where death had become the dominant force. The journey ahead would test every skill I'd developed, every lesson I'd learned, and every choice I'd made since Yellowstone erupted and changed everything forever. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I believed we were going to make it. My knowledge of death was finally going to help me master the art of staying alive.